208 years. That is exactly how long, without a single break, the furnaces of this factory in the town of Ilion, New York, burned. Remington is the oldest gunmaker in America. They started forging barrels when Napoleon was still alive, and the Wild West wasn't even on the map. Every rifle that won the West and every Marine sniper barrel came from here. The factory was the heart of the Mohawk Valley, where 5 generations of the same family worked on the same machines. Locals used to say, if Ilion sneezes, Remington catches a cold. The town and the brand were Siamese twins. But in March 2024, the fire went out forever. The last workers walked out of 1 million square feet of empty factory floor, and the equipment was hauled 1,000 miles south. The legendary brand committed a corporate escape, abandoning the home that had become too expensive and politically hostile. How did the company that armed the U.S. military in every war for 2 centuries end up bankrupt, sold for parts, and a refugee in its own country? This isn't just a story about business. This is a story about how politics, lawsuits, and the insatiable greed of Wall Street killed America's oldest legend. Part 1. Origins, the forge in the ravine. To understand the scale of the loss, we need to go back to the very beginning, to a world of mud, iron, and stubbornness. 1816. America is a young agrarian country. In the Mohawk Valley lives a young guy named Eliphalet Remington II. He is 23 years old. He watches his father work in the forge and dreams of his own rifle. In those days, a rifle wasn't a luxury. It was a tool for survival. But a good rifle cost money. Eliphalet asks his father for money to buy a barrel. His father, a stern man of the old school, refuses. If you need something, make it yourself, he says. Most people would have stopped there. But Eliphalet was different. He went into the ravine behind their farm. He started collecting scrap metal, broken horseshoes, rusty tools, pieces of a plow. He fired up the forge. He heated the iron to a white heat and began to beat it with a hammer. Over several weeks, through trial and error, he forged his first barrel. He took it to a local gunsmith to have the rifling cut inside. The master looked at the kid's work and was stunned. The quality of the metal, the purity of the forging were perfect. Eliphalet assembled the gun and went to a shooting competition. He took second place. But people weren't looking at the shooter. They were looking at the gun. "Where did you get that?" they asked. "Made it myself," he answered. By the end of the day, he walked home with pockets stuffed with orders from neighbors. That is how this business was born. Not in a shiny office, not at an investor meeting. It was born in a dirty ravine, out of anger, and a desire to prove to a father what you are capable of. But craftsmanship alone wasn't enough. Logistics were needed. And here, fate smiled on Remington. Just a few miles from the forge, construction of the Erie Canal began. For the 19th century, this was the same as the internet for the 21st. It was a superhighway. The canal connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. Suddenly, Eliphalet had access to the whole world. He could buy coal and ore from Pennsylvania for pennies. He could ship his heavy rifles on barges to New York, and from there to any point on the planet, cheaper than any competitor, hauling cargo by horse. Ilion began to build itself around the factory. It was a classic example of American paternalism. Remington didn't just pay wages. He built a town. He gave money for a school. He built a church. He organized a fire department. In return, he demanded only one thing: absolute loyalty and quality. Workers in Ilion didn't consider themselves hired employees. They considered themselves part of a clan. The quality of steel was a matter of personal honor. If you made a bad barrel, you didn't disgrace the company. You disgraced your family in front of your neighbors. Part 2. The Ascent, Typewriters and Wars, the mid-19th century. The Civil War is tearing America apart. For Remington, it was a moment of explosive growth. The Union Army needed revolvers, thousands of revolvers. The factory ran around the clock. Money flowed like a river. But the war ended. and silence fell. Military orders vanished in a single day. Warehouses were stuffed with weapons no one needed. The company stood on the brink of bankruptcy. And then they did what today we would call a genius pivot. Remington engineers looked at their machines. They knew how to make small, precise metal parts. What else consists of small, precise parts? Sewing machines and typewriters. In 1873, Remington releases the world's first commercially successful typewriter, the Scholes and Glidden typewriter. Think about the irony. The very same hands, the very same machines that yesterday made triggers for killing, today were making keys for writers. It was Remington that gave the world the QWERTY layout you type on today. Later, this business spun off to become Remington Rand. But its roots, its DNA, are here, in the gun shops of Ilion. They saved the factory by beating swords into plowshares. But the 20th century demanded weapons again. World War I, World War II. The plant in Ilion turned into an impregnable fortress. It grew to monstrous proportions. It was a real city within a city, a labyrinth of 4-story brick buildings connected by covered bridges hanging over the town streets. Here they produced millions of Springfield and Enfield rifles for the Allies. Every worker knew what he was making would save the life of a soldier in the trenches of Europe. This gave the work a sacred meaning. After the war, in 1950, Remington releases a product that would become their calling card for half a century: the Model 870 shotgun. The engineers set a task: make a weapon that will work in mud, in a swamp, in snow, a weapon that is impossible to break. And that will be cheap. They created a masterpiece, a steel receiver, twin action bars instead of one, so it wouldn't jam. It was the Kalashnikov of the shotgun world. Over the next decades, more than 11 million units were sold. It is the most popular shotgun in human history. Farmers have it, cops have it, the military has it. And every single one of those 11 million was dreamed up and made by the people of Ilion. Part 3. Greatness, the Green Giant. 1962 arrives, the birth of a legend, the Model 700 rifle. If the 870 was a sledgehammer, the 700 was a surgeon's scalpel. Remington engineers created a bolt action of such precision and strength that it became the global benchmark. Based on this rifle, the Marine Corps and the U.S. Army built their M40 and M24 sniper systems. Any sniper in the world knew, if you're holding a Remington 700 and you miss, that's on you, not the rifle. During this time in the 70s and 80s, the plant in Ilion was at the zenith of its power. The company was owned by the chemical giant DuPont. The DuPont family was the perfect owner. They had endless pockets, and they understood manufacturing. They didn't meddle with the blueprints. They simply ensured financial stability. The chemical giant let the engineers do what they did best: build the finest rifles in the world. Ilion thrived. It was a time when landing a job at the factory, at Big Green, as the company was called due to its logo, was like winning the lottery. The United Mine Workers Union was strong, wages were high. A man standing at a lathe could afford a good house, a new car, a fishing boat, and send his kids to college. The social contract worked flawlessly. You gave the company your craftsmanship and loyalty. The company gave you security and pride. The slogan, Remington Country, became more than just an ad. It was a cultural code for all of rural America. It meant, we are one of you, we are reliable, we are the real deal. No one in Ilion back then could imagine this golden age would end, that people would come for whom steel, tradition, and pride were empty words, obstacles to the numbers in an Excel spreadsheet. Part 4. Signals of change, investors and defects. The catastrophe began in 2007, and it didn't come in the form of a war or a crisis. It came in the form of men in expensive suits from Wall Street. Private equity firm Cerberus Capital Management bought Remington. Remember that name. In Greek mythology, Cerberus is the three-headed dog guarding hell. For Ilion, this name became prophetic. The financiers from Cerberus didn't know guns. They knew how to squeeze money out of assets. They created the Freedom Group Holding and began aggressively buying up other brands, hanging the debt on Remington. But the scariest thing was happening inside the workshops. Optimization began. Managers demanded cost reductions, first subtly, then aggressively. They bought cheaper metal, they sped up the assembly line, they cut quality control. The result didn't take long. The legendary Remington quality, built over 200 years, collapsed in a couple of years. New rifles were covered in rust spots right in the box. The finish was so cheap it couldn't hold back moisture. Fans who once worshipped the brand coined a new, humiliating nickname, Rustington. It was a spit in the face to the workers of Ilion, who saw what was happening but couldn't stop the managers. And then the thunder struck. The trigger mechanism scandal. It turned out the legendary Model 700 had a deadly defect. The rifle could fire by itself, without pulling the trigger, just by taking it off safety. Internal documents showed Remington knew about this problem for years, but hid it to avoid spending money on retooling. Dozens of people were killed and wounded due to accidental discharges. Courts forced the company to recall millions of guns. It cost a colossal amount of money, but the reputation cost even more. The words Remington and reliability ceased to be synonyms. In parallel, the outside world was changing. The political climate in New York State was turning icy. In 2013, after the terrible tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary, the state passed the SAFE Act. It was one of the strictest gun laws in the country. Remington found itself in a schizophrenic situation. They were the largest employer in the region. They paid taxes. But the politicians of the state where they operated openly called their products evil. Governor Andrew Cuomo publicly urged banks and investors not to invest in gun companies. The factory in Ilion was behind enemy lines, under siege. Part 5. The Fall, Sandy Hook, and Bankruptcy. The tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012 became the point of no return. The killer used a Bushmaster rifle, a brand that belonged to the Remington Empire. America was in shock. The parents' grief was immeasurable, and the victims' families decided to do what was previously considered impossible. They didn't sue the shooter. They sued the manufacturer. Remington. In the U.S., there is a law protecting gun makers from lawsuits over crimes committed with their products. But the family's lawyers found a loophole. They attacked not the product itself, but the marketing. They claimed Remington's advertising was too aggressive, that it instilled a sense of omnipotence in young men and pushed them toward violence. It was a long, grueling process. In 2022, Remington, or rather their insurance companies, surrendered. They agreed to pay the families $73 million. It was a precedent. For the first time in history, a gun giant paid for a mass shooting. But the financial hole in the ship's hull had been punched even earlier. Cerberus Capital, having played enough at being arms barons, wanted out of the game. But selling a toxic asset with $1 billion debt was impossible. The company was drowning under the weight of loans that its own owners had hung around its neck. In 2018, Remington files for bankruptcy, tries to restructure, emerges, and in 2020, files again. This was the end. The great empire, built over 2 centuries, was dragged to the auction block and dismembered like a carcass in a slaughterhouse. The ammunition brand, the green boxes of ammo, went to the company Vista Outdoor. The Marlin rifle brand went to competitors at Ruger. And the factory in Ilion itself, the historic heart, and the Remington firearms brand, no one wanted to take them. It was a toxic asset. An old factory, expensive workers, angry politicians. At the last moment, they were bought by a group of unknown investors, the Round Hill Group. They called themselves Rem Arms. The factory stood, but it was already an orphan, without brothers, without sisters, without DuPont money, one-on-one with reality. Part 6. The Crash. Goodbye, Ilion. The new owners tried to jumpstart Ilion in 2021. They called the workers back. The assembly line started moving again. The town had hope. People thought, we survived the Civil War. We survived the Great Depression. We'll survive this too. But the math was against them. The factory building was a magnificent monument of 19th century architecture. But for 21st century manufacturing, it was a nightmare. Massive heating bills, leaking roofs, inefficient logistics. Parts had to be hauled up and down stairs. Plus New York State taxes, some of the highest in the nation. Plus a tough union that refused to give up the gains of the past. The owners of Rem Arms sat down with a calculator. They looked south, Georgia, the city of LaGrange. There they were offered a deal. A new, modern facility, a 10-year tax holiday, cheap power, and most importantly, no unions. Local workers were ready to work for less money and ask fewer questions. The choice between historical heritage and profit for modern managers is obvious. In late 2023, the announcement came that buckled the knees of Ilion residents. The factory is closing. For good. New York doesn't want us, the managers stated cynically, shifting the blame onto the politicians. March 2024, the final scene of this drama. Imagine the shop floor, echoing, empty, the last shift. Men and women, many of whom gave this place 30, 40 years of their lives. They shut down the machines. They kill the lights. They walk out into the street, into the wet snow. The town is in mourning. In bars, in stores, in kitchens, everywhere there is one theme: silence. The mayor of Ilion, fighting back tears, told reporters, "It's not just losing a job, it's like losing a family member. We don't know who we are now without Remington." Semi-trucks loaded with equipment headed south. And in the center of town, a giant brick skeleton remained standing. 1 million square feet of emptiness. A monument to an era when things were built to last and companies took care of their people. Part 7. Conclusion of the story. Remington's departure from New York is not just a business case. It is a symbol of the Great American Divide. Business today votes with its feet. Capital has become a nomad. Companies flee blue, democratic states with high taxes and unions for red states, where they are met with open arms and cheap labor. The political map has become more important than the historical homeland. Hometown patriotism is dead, replaced by tax optimization. The second lesson is the role of private equity. They often act like locusts. Cerberus came in, squeezed Remington dry, ruined the quality, loaded the company with crippling debt to pay themselves bonuses, and left it to die. If the company had remained independent or family-owned, like in the old days, it might have weathered the political storm. It could have adapted. But Wall Street's financial games left it no chance. Gun laws didn't kill Remington, debt killed it. And finally, a lesson for the people of Ilion. And for all of us. No history, no 200 years of loyalty, no medals of your grandfathers will save you if the total line in the Excel sheet shows a minus. The company town model, where the entire community depends on one breadwinner, is the most vulnerable, most dangerous model in the 21st century. When a giant falls, it crushes everyone standing nearby. The memory of the great weapons remains in museums and collectors' safes. But the future has moved south, to Georgia. And in Ilion, only an epitaph remains. History was forged here, now it is simply quiet.